Okay, so this is the video where we're going to be answering questions that came up over the series we've done on the book of Acts, chapters 2 and 4, where we were specifically focusing on the communal life of the early church. And there were some really good questions that came up over the course of this series, and we're glad to try to tackle them today. So, Doreen, you want to take the first one?
Yes, I would love to. First question. Have there been people join your community who were Christians and had very close bonds with family and friends / community, but still choose to join? That is a great question, and I can say that certainly has happened and happens. And of course, everybody's story is different, and that includes the nature of their family relationships. No two relationships are the same. Some folks who've joined the community have parents who are aging and not on the community, so they'll visit them more often and try to be of service in whatever way they can to their parents or family members. But family members who are not members themselves are also welcome to come visit.
Mm-hmm. Great. Next question. I have many wealthy Christian friends. I have always been confused by this. What are your thoughts on Christians who are very wealthy? Thanks. That's a tough one. It seems to me that Jesus is pretty clear about renouncing wealth and giving it to the poor, as something you should do if you're a disciple, which is why we here at the Bruderhof give up rights and claims to money and property. But I think it's also a mistake to judge others when we can never really know their motivations and what they've been led to in their lives, what their consciences are telling them. And ultimately, all of us, and especially those of us who confess that we believe Christ, are going to have our actions and inactions judged. And that includes how we used the resources at our disposal. That applies to us here at the Bruderhof as well. And clinging to material possessions for ourselves, it's pretty clear, is not going to win God's appreciation and approval.
Yes, and by the same token, it reminds me of the parable of the talents. Mm-hmm. Like, you have to share your gifts and abilities and talents. So that's a really good question. The next question I have here is also a great one. Is there a difference between intentional community and community resulting from being filled by the Spirit? In other words, is community a command given by God, or should community naturally flow out of a love for Christ and a desire for His peace to rule the world? Thank you for this video and your exploration into this area. Thank you for your kind words and for the great question. I think there's a lot of intentional communities out there. I mean, I'm no expert, but they seem to form around shared interests or commitments to things like regenerative agriculture, organic farming, co-housing, ecological harmony, renewable energy, off-the-grid living. I mean, I think the list could go on, and it's all very interesting, and also laudable. All these impulses to share and renew the earth, it's great. But the reason we live in community is simply to be obedient to the commands of Christ. And Christ has to be central to that. So we believe this is the best way we can be of service to Him and to our neighbors, and all those other rich attributes can flow from that.
Next question. I love your lifestyle and think it is much better than secular Christianity, but isn't the idea presented in the gospel not about our fallen world, but the world to come? Meaning we are not called to make heaven on earth that is passing away anyways and will be reborn at the Perusia, Doreen. Meaning the call is not a materialistic one, but an inward transformation, one that reverts our values based on a worldly culture. You see even Paul working a secular job, tent making, not necessarily living in a community. You see the apostles having houses. Peter keeping his boat. Did he? I don't know. Many early saints living a solitary life in the desert, etc. Seems there is more than one way of baking a cake. God bless you. I think, I'm not going to argue with that. There's definitely more than one way to bake a cake. Sometimes the cake is not as good if you bake it some ways. And, more seriously, I think, inward transformation is where it starts. But you can't escape the fact that inward transformation needs to affect the material world. Jesus tells us to pray for His kingdom to come on this earth. And that means we also need to work to make his kingdom visible on earth in how we live. You know, in the Lord's Prayer as well, it says, we don't just pray, give us today our daily bread, and then expect food to show up on the table without us doing something to help it happen. We also need to take concrete action to the best of our ability to live justly and love our neighbor as ourselves, which is really what community life is all about.
Yeah, that's a great, I really like the way the person framed that question, because it does make you think about all the different applications of your faith, but at the same time, like, the fruits will show. Mm-hmm. So if the cake is good, then you've baked it well. So here's a question about friendship. So they're asking about friendship in our community. Do people focus on forming friendships with those they really like, or are they formed in a way that brings anyone into the circle of friends? In a community like ours, it's very important that everyone feels a part of the whole and that no one's excluded or left out. So practicing hospitality means that there shouldn't be exclusive circles of friends and buddies and compadres, but everyone should feel welcome and should feel at home. So that's the most important aspect. Of course, there are close friendships and mentor relationships and all that. But,
the Apostle Paul actually admonishes, I think, the church in Corinth very much about this, where, like, I think the rich people in the church, or the people who had more, were getting together before the common gathering and having a good time, and celebrating, and then the poorer ones would come to celebrate the Lord's Supper, and Paul, admonishes them, like, did you not discern the body? Meaning, basically, the church needs to be one. There shouldn't be, some people having a better time than other people over there.
And I think if you level the playing field economically, it becomes easier.
Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise, it's just like anywhere else. Mm-hmm. Anyway, next question. This is a longer one. I am very glad to hear that the Bruderhof is opening up to the idea of discussing and learning about theology and not shying away from it, because it is only head knowledge versus living it out, as Timothy Kutterling explained. Timothy was on in one of our previous videos. One thing I was hoping you would talk about is the idea that God brought or allowed persecution to come to the early church that lived in community, as described in Acts, to cause or force them to break up and help spread the gospel to the world, rather than staying together. Sorry, I lost my place here. And living in community. I have heard this explanation from other evangelical Christians who don't live in full community as you do, to explain why the early church didn't continue to live in community as described in Acts. I was wondering what you think of this explanation as to why they didn't continue to live in community, if indeed they didn't. In other words, living in community may not be the best way to go out and make disciples of all nations, as Christ commanded. I was wondering how you would respond to that idea or question. And thinking about it further, I would think living in community would probably provide a good base to send out missionaries to share the gospel as Christ commanded.
Nailed it.
A lot to, I think I agree with the last sentiment. But to respond to the explanation this person received from evangelical Christians, I actually think that's a bit of a dodge. First of all, I don't believe God sends persecution to persuade people to change what they're doing. I mean, you just have to look at the example of the apostles who were arrested for preaching, and they basically went straight from jail back to preaching. It wasn't like, I guess we shouldn't be preaching. And also, when you talk about mission and spreading the gospel, I think it's important that we think about, what does that mean? It actually means calling people to a different way of being and living. And from what I can tell, that's going to involve close communion with other people. It's not something, you can't be a lone ranger Christian. It's going to be community. The gospel is pretty clear that we should be doing the things that it tells us, not just acknowledging Jesus in our words. And just to be clear, mission is important to us on the Bruderhof, and we pretty much always have people out doing exactly that. But they're out there, and the only way it makes sense for them to be out there is that they have something to point to and say, here's a place where people are trying to do these things. We're not just, making some religious acknowledgement of Jesus as Lord. We're trying to live as if he really is in our lives. and in our relationships.
Absolutely. So here is the next question. This one's loaded. I had a civil disagreement with a brother over the frequency of observing the Lord's Supper. He thought it should be observed at every meeting of a local church body, so I guess that means weekly, and thought that churches who observed it monthly, quarterly, yearly, or irregularly were missing out, or even denying the opportunity for a blessed sacrament from God. One of his primary arguments hinged on this passage and the interpretation of breaking bread together as not just sharing communal meals, but specifically observing the Lord's Supper. What are your thoughts on frequency of the Lord's Supper? I know in the Bruderhof it is observed without schedule and fairly infrequently, something turned to when the community is moved to do so. I find a great deal of arguments to show that a very frequent practice of communion has both healthy and unhealthy effects on a church. And obviously, a less frequent observance has similar and opposite positive and negative effects. That's very thoughtful and thorough question on communion and the Lord's Supper. But, there's no biblical mandate as to how often or when or where we should celebrate the Lord's Supper. For us, I think it's really important that it's never viewed as just a religious observance or just a part of a worship service or liturgy. It's much deeper and more significant than that because it points us to Jesus' sacrifice and his presence in the visible community of believers. So for us, we don't celebrate it as part of a liturgical calendar, but at times where as a church, we've gone through difficulties or struggles, or when an important decision is being made, or when someone in our church is going through sickness or their health is affected, or we're coming together to pray and to beseech God for his blessing and his leading in our lives.
And we're Anabaptists, right? So, a big Anabaptist insight into the Lord's Supper is that it's a simple meal of remembrance. It's not, there's nothing particularly special about the bread or the wine. There's not a priest through whom, the Catholic understanding. For us, it's a much simpler and yet a deep experience of, unity amongst ourselves and, also the presence of Christ in our midst. So
right, and also you can't come to communion or the Lord's Supper if you haven't, if your relationships with everyone else isn't clear or you've solved all issues that may stand in the way of unity.
Yeah. Last question. Do you have an ordinance of humility, washing the feet? 2. Is this still relevant for self-examination and ... Foot washing, that's not something we do. And my understanding of that is that why we don't is that foot washing was a common practice in Jesus' time, so it wouldn't have seemed out of the ordinary. Servants would wash people's feet because they were dirty from walking. And today, it would just feel a little bizarre. What was important in that is that Jesus took the role of someone of a low social position, and that's something each of us can do every day in community, be it washing dishes after a communal meal or cleaning a communal space, or, a more modern equivalent to foot washing, I was actually thinking, is vacuuming the car, the communal car that's shared. That's the mode of transport we use today. And that service of love to someone else, having a clean vehicle for them to get into might be the modern foot washing.
Right, because you often didn't make the mess yourself either.
Yeah.
So you're really having to go above and beyond, which is the sentiment, I think.
Yeah. Well, those are all the questions we have for this series. Thank you so much for sticking with us. And if there are more questions you have, feel free to ask them. And if you have any suggestions for things we might talk about in a future series, please let us know in the comments.